Welcome to Hope Stories, where one moment of kindness can spark a storm that changes everything. Imagine an elderly mother, invisible to the world she sacrificed everything for, left with nothing but heartbreak and hunger. Then picture a stranger reaching out a hand, only to uncover secrets so dark they threaten to shatter families and expose buried betrayals. This isn't just a story about pain, it's about the courage to confront the past and the impossible choices love sometimes demands. What would you do if telling the truth meant losing everyone you ever loved? Stay with us, because what happens next will challenge your heart and make you question where forgiveness ends and justice begins as we step into the extraordinary journey you're about to hear. The summer heat clung to the Chicago streets like a suffocating blanket as Margaret Maggie Smith shuffled along the cracked sidewalk, clutching a worn canvas bag that held all she owned. At 72, her hands were stiff, her back bent from decades of scrubbing floors and cooking meals for other families. Once, she had believed that sacrificing her dreams for her 6 children would guarantee her a safe, loved old age. But love had long since evaporated. They had cut her off with clinical precision, changing numbers, ignoring calls, treating her as if she were an embarrassment to be erased. When the landlord posted the eviction notice, none of them answered her pleas. Now blistered feet carried her aimlessly past gleaming downtown towers that seemed to mock her invisibility. She wasn't just hungry, she was humiliated. Her children, Robert the store manager, Fiona the nurse, Charles the accountant, Patricia the school teacher, Mark the foreman, and Julia the boutique clerk, lived comfortably. They owed it all, ironically, to an old lawsuit that had left a man named Richard Anderson broken 2 decades earlier. Maggie didn't know all the details. She only remembered her late husband's shame at how the case had twisted the truth. But the money had come, and with it, an ugly change in her children. Entitlement replaced gratitude. Respect soured into cruelty. That afternoon outside a Bank of America branch, the world tilted. Maggie's knees buckled, her vision blurred. As she collapsed against the blistering pavement, a man in a tailored navy suit stopped. He should have kept walking. People usually did. Instead, he knelt, his cufflinks catching the sun, and asked, "Ma'am, are you all right?" Richard Rick Anderson had built an empire in New York, but what he saw in Maggie's gaunt face hit him harder than any boardroom battle. It was his mother's eyes, the same kind ones he'd buried years ago with a heart full of regret. He didn't ask for her story. He simply helped her to his car, drove her to his penthouse in Manhattan, and gave her a room that smelled of clean sheets and safety. For the first time in decades, Maggie felt human. Rick's home wasn't just lavish, it was warm. Every dinner she cooked was met with genuine gratitude. Every vase she filled with fresh-cut flowers was admired. In the hush of those high-rise nights, as Manhattan's lights flickered like a sea of stars, a bond formed. They talked on the balcony about dreams deferred and wounds that never healed. And in Rick's voice, Maggie heard something she thought had died in men long ago: respect without agenda. But serenity has a way of stirring buried ghosts. When Rick's legal team unearthed inconsistencies in the 20-year-old case that destroyed his first company, the pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. The fraudulent witnesses, the exaggerated injuries, the coerced statements, the Smith siblings' signatures on damning documents. And Maggie's heart cracked anew when Rick gently showed her the files. She recognized the lies she'd suspected but never proved. The lawsuit that gave her children their easy lives had been a fraud. Worse, they had abandoned her to hide it. Rick faced a moral crossroads. He could let it go, preserve Maggie's fragile peace. Or he could seek justice, risking the only family he had found in years. Maggie's nights became sleepless. Could a mother testify against her own flesh and blood? What kind of children traded their mother's dignity for cash? The answer came unbidden when Mark tracked her down one morning during her walk in Rick's private garden. His words, dripping with entitlement, cut deeper than any lawyer's letter. "You need to make him drop this, Mom. Do you want us in prison? After all we've done for you?" She looked her grown son in the eye, the same boy she once rocked to sleep, and saw no remorse, only fear of losing what was never rightfully his. Something hardened in her then. A lifetime of swallowed pain gave way to a rare blazing clarity. "All you've done for me?" she whispered. You left me to starve. Mark flinched. He didn't expect her voice to carry steel. If prison is what it takes for you to understand consequences, so be it. By the time Rick came home that evening, Maggie had made her choice. The shame was theirs, not hers. And for the first time, Rick allowed himself a bitter smile. Justice wasn't just a legal term. It was love in its fiercest form, even when it looked like betrayal. What neither of them knew was how far the Smith children were willing to go to keep their secret buried. One of them had already contacted an old acquaintance in the press. Another whispered about hiring someone who didn't wear a suit to talk some sense into Rick. The war for truth had only begun, and Maggie stood at its very heart, an elderly woman who had nothing left to lose except the newfound dignity she would never again surrender. Would you stand against your own family if it meant finally claiming your worth? How far would you go to protect someone who saved you when no one else cared? That night, as thunder rolled over Manhattan, a single phone call shattered their fragile peace and set in motion a reckoning none of them could escape. The phone call came just after midnight, slicing through the quiet hum of the Manhattan skyline. Rick answered on instinct, his voice low, cautious. On the other end, a man's tone carried the cold certainty of someone who knew too much. Tell Mrs. Smith to keep her mouth shut, or the next headline won't be about an old fraud case. It'll be about an old woman found dead in a city gutter. The line went dead. Rick stood frozen, the pulse in his temples pounding like war drums. He turned to find Maggie standing in the hallway, clutching her robe, her eyes wide but eerily calm. She had heard every word. It wasn't just about shame anymore. Her children were crossing into violence. The following days blurred into a haze of fear and resolve. Maggie moved through Rick's penthouse like a ghost, tending to chores automatically, her mind spiraling. These were the same children whose scraped knees she once kissed, whose birthdays she scraped pennies together to celebrate. Could they truly be capable of hurting her? The moral dilemma gnawed at her heart. Was justice worth her life? And yet each memory of being left hungry, each unanswered call from the cold apartment where she nearly wasted away, fanned the flame of her resolve. She had sacrificed everything for them. Perhaps it was time to sacrifice the illusion of who they were. Rick, for all his steely businessman's exterior, was unraveling inside. He had built empires, stared down hostile takeovers, but nothing terrified him like the thought of losing Maggie, the woman who had become the family he didn't know he needed. Hiring extra security was easy. What kept him awake was the war inside her. He watched her sit on the balcony one evening, staring at the city, the sunset bleeding amber and crimson, and he heard her whisper to the empty air, "Where did I go wrong?" It pierced him deeper than the threat. He knelt beside her and with a steadiness he didn't feel said, "You didn't go wrong. They did. You gave them everything. You don't owe them your silence." The twist came when Fiona, the second eldest, appeared unannounced at Rick's door. She looked different, drawn, shadows under her eyes. Rick almost slammed the door, but Maggie's soft gasp stopped him. "Mom," Fiona said, her voice cracking, "they're planning something worse. Mark hired someone. It's not just threats. They want leverage before court. They think, if they scare you enough, you'll run." Her confession spilled out in sobs, the dam of denial finally breaking. Fiona wasn't innocent, but something in her had snapped at the thought of real blood being spilled. For Maggie, it was both a dagger and a strange balm. At least one of her children still felt shame, still had a fragment of a conscience. Yet this revelation deepened the crisis. It wasn't only about testifying now, it was about survival. Rick called his attorneys and the police, but Maggie stopped him with a trembling hand. "No. If you call now, they'll scatter, and we'll never prove what they did. Let me face them. Let me hear from their own lips how far they've fallen." Her courage terrified him. Her children's moral collapse was nearly complete, and the thought of her confronting them made his chest tighten. But her eyes, clearer and stronger than he'd ever seen, told him this was not negotiable. That night, Maggie wrote in an old notebook, her hands shaking as she drafted what looked suspiciously like a farewell letter. Rick found it and felt the chill of someone who realizes the person they love is preparing for the worst. "If they take my life," she had written, "let it be the proof that love without respect is death by 1,000 cuts. and let them live with it. He confronted her, furious and heartbroken, and for the first time they argued. She pleaded for the chance to reclaim her dignity on her own terms. He begged her not to martyr herself for people who never valued her. In that clash of wills, both realized the stakes had risen far beyond what either imagined. As the night wore on, thunder rolling again over Manhattan, a new resolve settled over Maggie. She would meet her children not as the meek mother they discarded, but as the woman they had underestimated for too long. And Rick, torn between love and fear, would have to decide whether to stand back or stand beside her when the confrontation came. What would you choose if justice meant risking the very life you just rediscovered? Outside, a black sedan idled beneath the streetlight, and neither Maggie nor Rick knew yet whether it carried salvation or the beginning of their darkest hour. Stay with us to witness what happens when the past finally comes to collect its debt. The black sedan under the streetlight did not move all night, its windows tinted so dark they reflected only the neon glow of the corner bodega. By dawn, Rick had not slept. He sat at the edge of Maggie's bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, feeling the terrible weight of knowing someone might want to harm her. When she woke, there was no fear in her eyes, only a steady resignation. "I know they sent someone," she said softly. "A mother can feel when her children are near, even in the dark. But this time, they don't come with love." Her words cut him deeper than the midnight call. Maggie's struggle had shifted. It was no longer just about testifying, but about what it meant to love children who had chosen betrayal over blood. The moral wound festered inside her. Could she still love them and stand against them? Or would love itself demand that she shield them from the punishment they deserved? Later that day, Rick's attorneys called with news that twisted the knife even further. One of his investigators had uncovered bank transfers suggesting that part of the fraudulent settlement money had been laundered through a charitable foundation Maggie had unknowingly endorsed years ago. On paper, it looked like she, too, had profited from the scam. Legally, it meant little. She had never seen a dime. But in the court of public opinion, it would look damning. The children weren't just threatening her safety. They were preparing to destroy her credibility. Maggie's hands trembled as she read the report. The humiliation she had endured in private was one thing, but the thought of strangers believing she was complicit made her stomach turn. Rick tried to soothe her, promising the truth would win out, but Maggie faced a deeper internal battle. She whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe I failed them. Maybe all this ugliness is my fault." It stunned Rick. He had seen powerful men deny responsibility their whole lives, yet here was a woman willing to shoulder blame for the choices of 6 grown adults. He grabbed her hands. "You didn't fail. They did. Stop carrying sins that aren't yours." His voice cracked, betraying how much she meant to him. That night brought another unexpected knock on the door. Julia, the youngest, stood there with a manila envelope clutched to her chest. She looked terrified. Inside the envelope were photographs. Grainy surveillance shots of Maggie walking alone, candid images taken from across streets outside Rick's building, even one of her napping by the window. "Mark and Robert hired someone worse than I thought," Julia confessed through tears. "They said if you testify, they'll ruin you and him, or worse." Her fear was real, but so was her shame. She admitted she'd followed orders at first, out of loyalty and fear of her older brothers, but something about watching her mother on those photos, so small and unaware, had broken her. Maggie felt both betrayal and a strange flicker of hope. Julia's confession meant at least one child saw her as more than an obstacle, but it also deepened the moral chasm she faced. Could she forgive Julia and still pursue justice? Could she testify, knowing it might send her daughter to prison alongside the others? She sat at the kitchen table long after Julia left, staring at the photographs. Each image felt like a funeral for the family she thought she had. Rick, pacing nearby, wanted to call the police immediately, but Maggie stopped him again. "Not yet," she said, voice low but fierce. "I need them to face me first, not just as witnesses in court, but as children facing their mother's truth." Outside, the black sedan was gone by morning, but the message it carried lingered. The battle lines were drawn tighter now. There would be no easy way out. And somewhere deep inside, Maggie felt a strange calm. Love, justice, fear, they were all tangled, but she knew the next move had to come from her. If you were Maggie, would you protect your children despite their threats, or expose them no matter the cost? As the day of confrontation loomed, none of them could imagine the shocking revelation waiting that would shatter everything they thought they knew about family and betrayal. Stay with us to witness the storm about to break. Rick's legal team had barely finished strategizing when an unexpected development shattered the fragile sense of control they thought they had. Early one morning, a courier arrived with an unmarked package addressed to Maggie. Inside was a single USB drive and a note written in a scrawl she recognized instantly, her late husband's handwriting. Her heart pounded as she stared at it, the words almost trembling off the paper. For Margaret, if anything happens to me, you'll know the truth. Her husband had died decades ago after the accident, and yet he had left behind something none of them had ever seen. Rick plugged the drive into his laptop under Maggie's anxious gaze. What unfolded on the screen was a video recording dated weeks before her husband's death, his voice thin but steady as he explained the events of the accident. The twist was brutal. The accident truly was caused by negligence, but not by Rick's old company. The fault lay with an independent contractor hired secretly by her own eldest sons, Robert and Mark, who had cut safety costs and then used the tragedy to blame Rick's firm for profit. Maggie's stomach turned as the implications sank in. The fraud wasn't just exaggeration. It had roots in deliberate wrongdoing by her own children, and her husband had known but feared what revealing it would do to the family. Maggie felt the floor drop beneath her. She had been preparing herself to testify against lies and cruelty. But this was a darker betrayal than she had imagined. Her children hadn't just abandoned her. They had set the stage for their father's death and exploited it. The guilt she carried for years morphed into grief and rage. She pressed her trembling hands to her face, torn between wanting the world to know and fearing that dragging the truth into the light would destroy any remnant of her family name. Rick knelt beside her, voice low but firm. This changes everything in court. This clears you completely, Maggie. It clears me too. But you have to decide, how much of this truth can you live with once it's out? His words only deepened her inner conflict. Would exposing them bring justice, or only salt to wounds that might never heal? As if on cue, another blow landed. Fiona called, her voice shaking, not with remorse but with venom. Somehow she already knew about the package. If you show that video, Mom, we'll never forgive you. Dad's gone. Let him rest. Don't drag our family name through the mud for your own dignity. Maggie almost dropped the phone. Dignity? For decades she had been silent, starved, discarded, and now she was being told she owed them more silence. The war inside her reached a breaking point. Could a mother stop being a mother when her children had crossed every line of decency? Or was love supposed to excuse even this? That night, Maggie sat alone by the window. The city spread out below like an indifferent galaxy. Rick stood at a distance, giving her space. She remembered the hunger pangs, the unanswered calls, the years of humiliation. She also remembered tiny hands clutching hers, school plays, whispered prayers over sick beds. Both sets of memories belonged to the same children. Tears streaked her face as she whispered, "What kind of mother am I if I destroy them? And what kind if I don't?" It was the purest form of moral agony, the kind no courtroom could resolve. By dawn, she made a choice Rick didn't expect. She asked him to prepare 2 statements, one with the video, one without. "I need to see their faces when I decide," she said quietly. Her plan was dangerous. It meant meeting them before court, confronting them with the evidence their father left behind. It meant opening herself to whatever their desperation might unleash. But deep inside, Maggie knew she needed the truth in their eyes, whether it came with remorse or more betrayal. Only then could she choose between justice and mercy. If you were Maggie, could you expose such a devastating truth about your own children, or would you protect them despite everything? As Maggie arranged a secret meeting with all 6 children, unaware who might come with apologies and who might come with threats, the stage was set for a reckoning that would change all their lives forever. Don't miss what happens when mother and children finally collide. Maggie chose a small church hall on the outskirts of the city for the meeting. a place she once scrubbed floors in exchange for food when her children were little. It smelled faintly of old wood and candle wax, and she sat alone on a folding chair, clutching the flash drive in her palm like a burning coal. Rick waited outside with a security team, ready to step in if things turned violent. But this confrontation wasn't his to lead. It was hers. As the heavy doors creaked open, all 6 of her children filed in. Their faces bore different masks. Defiance on Robert, icy calculation on Mark, wariness on Fiona, and something unreadable on Julia and the others. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Robert sneered. "So this is what it's come to? Dragging us to a church to beg?" Maggie's voice, though soft, carried the weight of a storm. "I didn't call you here to beg. I called you to tell you the truth. Your father left me this before he died." She placed the drive on the table. "He knew what you did. He named you." The silence cracked like glass. Mark's jaw tightened. Fiona's face went pale. "You don't know what you're talking about," Mark snapped. "That accident was an opportunity. Dad would have understood." His slip sent a shiver down Maggie's spine. He wasn't denying it. He was rationalizing it. Julia burst into tears, whispering, "We didn't mean for him to get hurt. It was supposed to be temporary cuts, just to save money." Then the scaffolding. She clamped a hand over her mouth as Robert shot her a look that could kill. Maggie felt like she was drowning in their words. Her husband's death, her years of humiliation, her hunger, it had all been collateral damage in their hunger for wealth. And now, seeing them face to face, she was forced to reckon with an even deeper horror. They still didn't fully understand what they had done. Her heart tore between fury and a mother's love. She wanted to scream, to demand why, but what came out instead was a trembling question. "Do any of you feel sorry? Not for the money, for him, for me." Her voice broke on the last word. Julia sobbed harder. Patricia looked at the floor. Robert and Mark remained stone-faced. The chasm between them yawned wider with every heartbeat. Rick stepped into the doorway then, unable to watch her stand alone any longer, and his presence made Robert's eyes narrow. "So this is really about him," Robert spat. "You'd burn your own kids alive to please this man?" Maggie stood, her legs shaking, but her voice steadier than she thought possible. "No, I'd burn the lies to save whatever pieces of my family might still have a soul." Then the twist none of them expected came. Fiona pulled a second envelope from her bag and slid it across the table. Inside were photographs, different from the surveillance shots. These were of the contractor the brothers hired, but with Rick's former business partner shaking his hand. "It wasn't just us, Mom," she said bitterly. "Rick's partner knew about the safety violations. They all made money off that settlement. Maybe he's not as innocent as you think." Maggie felt the floor tilt again. Could it be true? Rick's face was unreadable, but his silence was deafening. The children weren't just fighting for their freedom. They were trying to rewrite the narrative, dragging Rick into the moral muck with them. Maggie felt the weight of 2 worlds pressing down. Was she prepared to expose her children if it also meant questioning the man who had saved her life? As the tension thickened, Maggie realized the hardest truth of all. Justice was not a clean line between guilty and innocent. It was a battlefield of half-truths and blood ties. And soon, she would have to pick a side. If you discovered the person who saved you might also carry a share of the blame, how would it change your choices? As Maggie stood between her children's threats and the possibility of Rick's hidden secrets, the next words she spoke would ignite a fire that no one in that room could escape. Watch what happens when love, betrayal, and justice finally collide. Maggie stood at the center of that drafty church hall, the weight of decades pressing on her frail shoulders. The flash drive with her late husband's testimony sat on the table beside Fiona's envelope, as if the past itself were daring her to choose. The children's faces reflected every shade of desperation and denial. Rick's face was unreadable, caught between his own wounds and the accusation against his old business partner. In that suspended moment, Maggie felt a strange calm. For years she had been silent, but silence had only birthed more lies. She took a slow breath and began to speak, her voice carrying the quiet thunder of a life that had suffered enough. "I loved all of you with everything I had. I worked until my hands bled so you could have choices I never did. But love without truth is poison. Your father knew what you did. He forgave you because he hoped you'd grow better. I cannot let that hope die." Robert surged forward, rage flashing. "You'd ruin us all. Do you want to see your own kids in prison?" Maggie's tears slipped freely, but her voice didn't waver. "I want to see my children free from the lies that have chained them for 20 years. If that means prison, then perhaps it's the only road back to your souls." Julia sobbed openly. Patricia clutched her hand and whispered apologies. Fiona stared at the floor, trembling. But Robert and Mark's hardened expressions didn't change. Mark's voice was ice. "And what about him? The man you worship? His company profited too. You think he's your savior? He's just like us." The room held its breath as Maggie turned to Rick. "Is it true?" she asked softly. Rick's eyes glistened, and for the first time she saw shame there. "I didn't know back then," he admitted, voice hoarse. "My partner hid the violations from me. By the time I learned the truth, the company was gone, the damage done. I stayed silent because I thought it was too late. That silence is my greatest regret." The confession cut through the room like glass. Rick wasn't the spotless savior she'd believed him to be, but Maggie understood something deeper. All of them carried guilt. All of them had chosen silence over truth. Her decision crystallized. She picked up the flash drive, holding it as though it were her husband's hand. "Tomorrow in court, I will tell the truth. About all of it. About the fraud, about my husband's death, and yes, about the company's negligence covered up by men who feared the cost of decency. I will not protect anyone from the truth. Not you, not Rick, not even myself. If the world must see the ugliness to understand the value of love and justice, then so be it." Her voice cracked, but her spine was straight. Robert stormed out first, slamming the door, his footsteps echoing into the night. Mark followed, face pale with fury. The others remained behind, shaken, some weeping, some silent. Maggie felt no triumph, only a strange bittersweet relief. The next day in court, her testimony was searing and unflinching. She spoke of love warped by greed, of a man's death turned into profit, of her own years of abandonment. The video of her husband played, and the courtroom wept. The judge's verdict weeks later brought prison sentences for Robert and Mark, vast lesser penalties for the others, and a public reckoning for Rick's former partner. Rick resigned from several boards, choosing integrity over power. Maggie returned to Rick's home not as a victim, but as a woman reborn. She still visited Julia and Patricia in the rehabilitation programs the court mandated, still sent letters to Robert and Mark in prison even when they went unanswered. She no longer begged for their love. She offered hers freely and let them decide what to do with it. Rick, humbled and freer than he'd ever been, became the son she had always deserved. Not because he was perfect, but because he had the courage to face his imperfections. Their home became a place where wounds were acknowledged, not hidden, where love was measured not by silence but by truth. Years later, on a quiet spring morning, Maggie tended the flowers in Rick's garden. Her hands were still rough, her back still bent, but her heart felt astonishingly light. She whispered to the breeze, as if to her late husband, "They know now. I told them. I kept my promise." Behind her, Rick watched with quiet reverence. Both of them had lost so much, and yet in the wreckage they had found a family built on something stronger than blood, honesty, dignity, and hard-won grace. It was not the ending Maggie once dreamed of, but it was real, and it was enough. How did this story make you feel, and what message will you carry from Maggie's journey? Comment 100 if you love this story. What country are you watching from? Share this video with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for watching this story on Hope Stories.